When France's powerful and formidable military leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, decided to invade Russia in 1812, a new chapter in European history was about to unfold. Napoleon's massive army, numbering over 150,000 men, included 80,000 cavalry, 370,000 infantry, and 400 cannons, making it one of the largest armies ever assembled in Europe. In comparison, the Russian army, consisting of 230,000 soldiers and 800 cannons, initially seemed weaker on paper. However, in reality, the Russian forces were highly resilient, accustomed to harsh weather conditions, and skilled in defensive strategies. Napoleon's biggest mistake was that he had no detailed plan for invading Russia. He assumed that merely by bringing such a vast army to the Russian border, Tsar Alexander I would be intimidated, immediately negotiate peace, and rejoin the continental system. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon, stationed on the banks of the Neman River in Lithuania, crossed into Russian territory with his army. The first few weeks of the campaign saw French successes, including the capture of Vilnius, an important city that became a central hub for French supply lines. The army then marched through present-day Belarus towards Moscow. However, the Russian army continuously retreated, drawing the French deeper into Russia. Napoleon underestimated the Russian strategy by allowing the French to advance far into their territory. The Russians aimed to make retreat nearly impossible and exhaust Napoleon's forces. Russian tactics, burning villages, destroying crops, poisoning wells, and killing livestock, ensured that the French soldiers faced extreme hunger, thirst, and disease. Guerrilla attacks from Russian villagers added constant harassment, while Russian troops continued small-scale raids on French supply lines. By midsummer, half of Napoleon's massive army was either dead sick or had deserted. Many non-French soldiers, inexperienced and often fighting for the first time, struggled to endure the harsh conditions. In contrast, Russian soldiers, composed largely of peasants and local workers, were accustomed to the land and its extremes, making them more resilient against France's onslaught. The combination of severe weather, lack of supplies, guerrilla warfare, and stretched supply lines caused widespread starvation and disease among the French army. Soldiers killed their own horses for food, but it was never enough to sustain such a vast force. On August 18, the French army reached Smolensk, where a significant battle occurred. The Russian army had fortified the city and was prepared for combat. Napoleon had the opportunity to fully surround the city and block all escape routes, which would have allowed him to annihilate the Russian forces. Instead, he made a crucial tactical error by attacking only the main gate, leaving other exits open. After heavy bombardment and street fighting, where approximately 14,000 Russian soldiers were killed and 10,000 French soldiers perished, the Russians managed to retreat once more. Napoleon captured the city but had to continue chasing General Barclay's army. At this point, Tsar Alexander I sent a decisive message. Enough had been done to wear down the French. It was now time to confront Napoleon directly. General Kutuzov, a 70-year-old seasoned Russian commander, was appointed supreme commander and took charge near Moscow. Kutuzov fortified positions near the village of Borodino, creating a defensive line to meet Napoleon's army. Napoleon, seeking a decisive battle, moved forward with renewed determination. On September 7, 1812, the Battle of Borodino began. Napoleon commanded 130,000 men with 187 cannons, while the Russian army consisted of 120,000 soldiers and 40 cannons. Although the armies were similar in size, the Russians had the advantage of fresh, well-rested troops, while the French soldiers were exhausted after months of marching. Enduring hunger, disease, and extreme heat, Napoleon himself was seriously ill, affecting his ability to make effective decisions. Despite this, he ordered a direct attack on the Russian positions, ignoring advice from his generals to maneuver around the enemy. The French suffered heavy casualties as they approached fortified Russian positions, with continuous artillery fire inflicting devastating losses. By the end of the day, 44,000 Russian and 35,000 French soldiers had been killed, 89,000 in a single day. Though the French army appeared to have an advantage, Napoleon failed to achieve the decisive victory he sought. Reserve forces, held back for critical moments, were either delayed or not deployed, allowing the Russian army to escape complete destruction. As the sun set, General Kutuzov withdrew his forces eastward toward Moscow, leaving the French exhausted and unable to pursue. The Battle of Borodino was one of Napoleon's bloodiest confrontations, a tactical French victory, but strategically inconclusive. Following the battle, Kutuzov made the bold decision to abandon Moscow rather than defend it. The city was left largely empty, with only 25,000 civilians remaining out of a population of 250,000. The Russian governor, Count Rostopchin, had orchestrated the evacuation and set fire to parts of the city before Napoleon's arrival. This scorched-earth strategy left the French army with no food, shelter, or resources to prepare for the approaching winter. Napoleon occupied Moscow for 6 weeks, hoping the Tsar would sue for peace, but Alexander I remained patient, using the harsh Russian winter as an ally, an invisible general that would weaken the invaders. When the first heavy snow arrived in October, Napoleon finally realized he could not maintain his army in the devastated city. With no provisions, insufficient winter clothing, and an exhausted army, he decided to retreat toward Vilnius, The 950-kilometer march back was filled with relentless attacks from Russian forces, local militias, and surviving villagers. The French soldiers, weakened by hunger and exposure, were decimated at every step. Looting had slowed their march and added to their burdens, and thousands perished due to the combination of starvation, disease, and constant ambushes. The retreat of Napoleon's army from Moscow became one of the most catastrophic military disasters in history. Out of the 450,000 men who began the invasion, barely a fraction survived returned to France. The once mighty French army was reduced to a shadow of its former strength, humiliated by the harshness of the Russian land, the strategic genius of Kutuzov, and the unyielding winner. Napoleon's reputation, previously unmatched in Europe, suffered a blow that highlighted the limits of military ambition and the dangers of underestimating both nature and an enemy determined to endure. Russia's vast expanse, combined with tactical retreats, scorched earth policies, and harsh climate, had effectively annihilated a force that was thought invincible. The campaign became a legendary example of strategy, endurance, and the devastating consequences of hubris in warfare. As Napoleon's army began its retreat from Moscow toward Vilnius on October 19, 1812, the situation rapidly deteriorated into a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The once mighty force of 450,000 men now resembled more of a scattered caravan than a disciplined military unit. Soldiers, many already exhausted by the scorching heat of summer, disease, and lack of supplies, were now subjected to the merciless onset of the Russian winter. Snow fell steadily, covering the already devastated landscape, making marching nearly impossible. Roads that had once been manageable now became treacherous, slippery, and riddled with ice, slowing the army to a crawl. Each step forward was a battle against both the environment and the relentless Russian pursuit. The retreat was not merely a logistical nightmare, it was a grueling test of human endurance, courage, and despair. Russian forces under General Kutuzov's strategic direction continually harassed the French columns. Cavalry units and light infantry engaged in frequent ambushes along the route, targeting isolated units, supply wagons, and stragglers. The peasants and villagers whose homes had been destroyed during the initial invasion now became fierce guerrilla fighters. They struck suddenly, killing, capturing, and looting as they vanished into the forests and snow-covered plains. Each French soldier had to remain constantly vigilant, knowing that danger could strike at any moment from any direction. Horses, essential for cavalry, artillery, and transport, had long since been slaughtered for food, leaving the army increasingly immobile and vulnerable. The destruction of livestock during the initial Russian retreat had been a calculated strategy to prevent the French from finding any sustenance, and it now paid devastating dividends. The morale of the troops plummeted as hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion took hold. Soldiers froze in the open fields at night, shivering in tattered uniforms and inadequate shoes. Feet swollen from frostbite made marching almost impossible. Many soldiers abandoned their weapons, torn clothing, and even artillery pieces just to keep moving and survive another day. Cannons, wagons, and supplies became more of a liability than an asset, as they slowed the army's progress and made them easy targets for Russian attacks. The soldiers who had marched for months in anticipation of glory now confronted the grim reality of survival, and many faced the impossible decision of abandoning their comrades or risking death by staying with them. Disease spread rapidly through the ranks, compounding the misery. Dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia claimed thousands of lives as weakened bodies could not withstand the combined effects of starvation and cold. The French army, already suffering from poor hygiene and cramped living conditions, was a perfect environment for epidemics. In many units, officers were unable to enforce discipline as men were too weak to march or follow orders. Desertion became common among non-French soldiers who had little loyalty to Napoleon and little hope for survival. Entire units simply disappeared into the forests, leaving behind only the echoes of their march. The once proud army of Europe was being systematically destroyed, not in a single battle, but by a combination of relentless pursuit, environmental hardships, disease, and starvation. As the army moved further west, the Russian forces maintained pressure. Kutuzov avoided direct, large-scale confrontations, knowing that attrition was the French army's true enemy. Skirmishes, artillery fire, and sudden attacks were enough to inflict maximum casualties while preserving Russian forces for future operations. French generals, overwhelmed by the chaotic retreat, often failed to coordinate defenses or respond effectively to threats. Communication between units was severely hampered by distance, snow, and constant attacks, leaving soldiers confused and vulnerable. Many supply lines had been destroyed months earlier, and what little food remained was looted by fleeing soldiers or captured by Russian raiders. Hunger drove some men to desperate measures, fighting among themselves for scraps of food, consuming horses' hides, or even succumbing to cannibalism in extreme cases, a horrifying testament to the severity of their plight. The geography of the Russian countryside further complicated the retreat. Frozen rivers became both obstacles and hazards. Crossing them required ingenuity and effort, as ice could not always support the weight of men, horses, and cannons. Forests, which had initially provided cover for Russian guerrilla attacks, now became traps for the French, slowing movement and enabling ambushes. Open plains exposed soldiers to artillery and rifle fire from a distance, making any attempt at organized defense perilous. The further Napoleon's army marched, the more fractured and scattered it became, losing cohesion, discipline, and command structure. As they passed through villages, the devastation left behind was stark. Farms had been burned, livestock killed, and food stores emptied. Russian civilians, though often fleeing the advancing French, had also hidden supplies or sabotaged them, ensuring that French soldiers could not find sustenance. This scorched earth strategy left the French army with no possibility of foraging or resupplying, forcing them to carry whatever meager provisions they had left. Even these provisions were insufficient, and soldiers often suffered from malnutrition, weakening them further for the arduous journey ahead. Starvation became rampant, and soldiers began to collapse by the roadside, unable to continue. Those who survived were often taken prisoner by Russian patrols or simply left to die in the freezing snow. Throughout the retreat, Napoleon himself was in a precarious position. Though he remained the supreme commander, his authority was increasingly undermined by circumstances. He had neither the manpower nor the resources to restore discipline, and the extreme conditions affected his ability to make effective decisions. The French officers, frustrated and demoralized, struggled to maintain order as their men scattered, sickened, or deserted. Napoleon's earlier confidence in his invincibility was shattered, as he realized that victory in Russia had been an illusion and that survival, not conquest, had become the priority. The army's march through Lithuania and Belarus was marked by continuous hardship. Snowstorms and freezing temperatures compounded the already dire situation. Soldiers' clothes were soaked, their feet frozen, and their bodies weak from months of sustained hardship. Hunger made even small skirmishes deadly, as soldiers lacked the energy to fight effectively. The constant threat of Russian attacks, combined with exhaustion and disease, decimated the ranks. Every day, the army lost thousands of men, and morale deteriorated further. Soldiers were forced to make impossible decisions between helping their comrades or trying to survive individually. By the time the remnants of Napoleon's army reached Vilnius, the devastation was total. What had once been the strongest army in Europe was reduced to a fraction of its original size. Thousands of soldiers had perished due to exposure, starvation, disease, or enemy attacks. Cannons and wagons had been abandoned or destroyed, and the once formidable cavalry was nearly extinct. The retreat had become a symbol of the catastrophic consequences of overreach, hubris, and the unforgiving power of both nature and human resilience. Napoleon's dream of subduing Russia had ended in a historic disaster, illustrating the limitations even the greatest generals could face when confronted with logistical impossibilities, harsh terrain, and determined opposition. The Russian strategy had been brilliantly executed. Kutuzov's combination of tactical retreats, scorched earth policies, and selective engagements ensured maximum French losses while preserving Russian forces for future campaigns. The Russian winter, often personified as an invisible general, had played a decisive role in destroying Napoleon's army without requiring a single large-scale battle. The French invasion had started with ambition and overconfidence, but ended with humiliation and irreversible loss. Napoleon, once considered the unconquerable master of Europe, now faced the harsh reality that his campaign had failed, leaving him with a shattered army and a severely damaged reputation. The retreat from Moscow became a legendary example of military disaster, human endurance, and the strategic genius of the Russians, and it remains one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of warfare.